Good day, and welcome to this webinar on policing the far right. My name is Dr. Keith Ditcham. I'm Senior Research Fellow in the Organised Crime and Policing Research Group at RUSI. I'm very pleased to be chairing our fourth event in the webinar series for our far right extremism and terrorism programme. This links and amplifies research from terrorism and conflict teams, the Organised Crime and Policing team, the International Security Studies team, and our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. Just to let you know that the event is being recorded and everything will be on the record, including the question and answer session. You will see at the bottom of your screens there is a button for the question and answers. Please use that to post your questions, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can for the panel. I'll introduce the panel shortly in a moment, but just to remind you that the raising your hand, the button has been disabled, so that won't work. So the only way to get your question is to post it in the QA function, and I will be monitoring that throughout today's session. And as I said, we'll hopefully get through as many questions as possible. The format of today's session is, rather than listen to presentations from our panelists, I'm going to fire some questions at them to get the conversation going, and may well intersperse that with questions as well from our invited audience. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. The first is, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leila Nouri, who is an Associate Professor of Criminology and Co-Director of the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea University. Leila specialises in online extremism, far and extreme right ideologies, and hate crime. Her work on extremist use of the internet has examined far and extreme right narratives, their dissemination via social media, and provided recommendations for policy and community responses. More recently, she has been actively working with the counter-terrorism policing and councils across Wales to combat hate visuals across communities through two projects, one called Street Snap and the other called Flip the Streets. Also presenting and sharing a camera today are Detective Chief Inspector John Hughes and his colleague, Detective Inspector Phil Pike. John is a career detective with 20 years service in the Metropolitan Police Service, working in a variety of roles from frontline policing to a range of specialist crime roles around firearms and murder investigation. In the last few years, he's moved to SO15, which is the Counter-Terrorism Command within the Metropolitan Police, initially working in the London Intelligence Unit and then investigations, leading reactive and proactive investigations into all types of terrorism in the UK, and that threatens UK interests here as well as overseas. He is the co-chair of the Extreme Right-Wing Terrorism Investigators Network and brings together good practice and development across the counter-terrorism regions. His colleague, Detective Inspector Phil Pike, has 15 years service in the same force, working across frontline policing, professionalism and counter-terrorism. He's been involved in counter-terrorism investigations and work since 2015, and achieving accommodations for his work on digital analysis on Operation Elematic, which is the 2016 Greenwich Tube bomb, and for his involvement in the planning of the late Queen's funeral, Operation London Bridge. In his current role, he leads a team of detectives investigating UK-linked terrorism of all types. And last but by no means, my colleague, Dr. Jessica White, who's a Senior Research Fellow in RUSI in the Terrorism and Conflict Group. Her expertise encompasses countering terrorism and violent extremism, policy and programming, with a focus on gender mainstreaming strategies. She has over a decade of experience, both as a researcher and as a practitioner, serving in military intelligence. Jessica co-leads RUSI's far-right extremism and terrorism research program and is a co-founder of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network. She's published on a range of topics, including gender insecurity, far-right extremism, and terrorism in the media. So a big welcome from me to our esteemed panelists, and also again to you, the audience, and thank you very much for joining us. So let's go on with some questions then. So the first question I'd like to ask, this one I'm going to ask of my colleague Jess to get the conversation going, but I would welcome input from our other panelists as well, is really to set things in context is, what do we mean with the umbrella term of far right or extremist, extreme right wing? And is it always clear? And if not, does that lack of clarity impact policing?
Thanks, Keith, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I think we'll have a really interesting discussion about policing of the far right or of the extreme right wing. And I think it's great that you start off with this question, Keith, because often I find in these conversations that we say far right or extreme right wing, and we assume that we're all talking about the same thing without actually knowing whether we're all talking about the same thing. And I think that there are a lot of elements of extremism, a lot of elements of hate speech, a lot of elements of violent extremism and terrorism that often fall under what we mean when we say far right. It could be white supremacy, it could be neo-Nazi, it could be ethno-nationalism, it could be anti-government. Of course, these are elements that are specific contextually to the places where we're talking about. They're often grounded in a local grievance or a predominance of one or the other of these in that local context, but they're also linked, inexorably linked transnationally across contexts. In the online space, they share narratives, they share bits of their ideology across different spaces. So I think it is a challenging thing to know that we're all talking about the same thing, and it's important. And I would assume, I mean, this question to John and Phil to tell us, it makes it challenging, I would assume, to police the far right when there is such an umbrella of things that fall under what you're looking at when you're talking about the far right. And if it's difficult to focus investigations when it might be mixed ideology, I think that adds another difficulty to this. We know that the online space has provided an opportunity to cherry pick from all these different ideologies and to mix them together in a way that often it doesn't even make sense. I mean, if you think about there are white supremacist group leaders that are not white themselves, yet they lead white supremacist groups. It doesn't logically make sense why people always support these different things, but they do. And the challenge around how to then counter that or prevent that from happening becomes even more complex, because you have to deal with such a mess of different ideologies that don't always make sense. So I just think it's important point to make here as we start, that when we're having conversations about the far right or about the extreme right wing, that we are clear in our conversations and perhaps get past using just this term far right and really delve into what we're talking about with specific cases and be clear about it. And I think it's even complicated one step further in today's environment with conspiracy, which there's a debate that happens in the space about whether conspiracy is extremism. And I think I would argue that they're slightly different, that they're two different things. Conspiracy is almost harder to reason with sometimes than extremist ideology, because everyone is the enemy, right? Anyone who tells you you're wrong is ultimately part of the enemy then. So it becomes very difficult. But in what we've seen, post-pandemic with the anti-vax conspiracy, what we've seen in the polarized political environment that exists today across much of Western Europe and North America, certainly this element of conspiracy has complicated the far right. It has complicated how we think about the far right, how we deal with the far right, and I'm sure has complicated how you police the far right as well, and how it expresses itself in local communities. So I'm not sure, Keith, that's not really an answer, but I think just a warning statement perhaps, or a encouragement that clarity is needed when we talk about this, and not, I think, to assume that we're all talking about the same thing when we use that term far right.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess. Before I come to our two policing colleagues around the impact of policing, Lila, is anything you wish to add that from a sort of academic point of view? I mean, how important are definitions? If they're too hidebound, is that also a problem, or not in your experience?
The thing with the far right is incredibly difficult, and I think Jessica sort of posits some really interesting thoughts there, which is we probably are all talking about very different things in terms of what our imagining of the specific far right is. And one of the things I wanted to add is that the difficulty with the far right is the fluidity. So we do see this with other extremist ideologies, but not so much as with the far right. Like, someone might associate with the far right just related to one particular theme or one particular problem or one particular event. And so that fluidity then changes our understanding of what it means to be part of an extremist sort of ideology. So that's particularly difficult. And also this differentiation between the far and the extreme, whereas the far is something that, you know, is perhaps normalized in society, but isn't to the point of being something that we'd be concerned about from an extremist point of view. So, yeah, I think we need to be really careful with this terminology, but that shouldn't scare us from using it, because we are talking broad brush about the same thing, but we do need to be specific when we're speaking about certain groups or whatever that may be. But yeah, we don't want to fall to the same pitfalls that we had previously in regards to conceptualization, which can take over and dominate this conversation. So in that sense, I'll leave my answer there.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. So if I come to John and Phil, if I may then, so in particular, I'd be interested in your views and how that plays out in relation to the response from policing.
I'm not sure. There's certainly no definition that, you know, that I could give, or the policing is, you know, we particularly hold around the kind of the differentiation lines between far right and extreme right in that sense. I think that as colleagues on the panel have said, the sort of term far right, I think it depends very much on your, you know, the political view you have, what the sort of levels of acceptable political discourse are, even within mainstream politics. That term can be bandied about. So I don't think it, for us in policing, is a huge issue. For us, the test is less whether it is far right or extreme right, but for us, the test always comes down to whether the act or the criminal act that is taking place is a terrorist act. And so for us, we fall back to the test, which is outlined in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000, that says that the criminal act has to be taking place for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. And this is something that we do come back to when we're looking at policing the extreme right, about has this criminal act taken place because it is for the purposes of advancing a set ideological cause, or is it done for a broader sense of kind of racial hatred? Because different pieces of legislation are in play, and thus the policing response is different, and particularly whether the terrorism police become involved or whether other aspects of policing or the state are engaged. So for us, that's the test that we really come down to. And yeah, as panel colleagues have said, that is not an easy thing to dissect with mixed and unclear ideologies, and also with single event issues like the pandemic and the sort of anti-vax, you know, the 5G masts being destroyed and that sort of thing. These are not always straightforward questions to answer. So yes, it does impact on policing, but it is not something that could be, it is a case-by-case basis for each and every criminal act, rather than something that can be dealt with by definitions. Yeah,
with the proviso that whatever the activity, it has to satisfy that test of being a terrorist act as per the Terrorism Act, as you outlined, Phil. Thanks very much. John, anything to add at all to that yourself or not?
No, it was just to echo Jess's comments about that unclear ideology. You know, the amount of times we see these confluence of ideas come together, you know, really at loggerheads sometimes, but they seem to knit together, and rather than having a vast swathe of similar ideologies, we are looking at bespoke ideologies person by person sometimes, and you know, it just makes it tricky and trying to understand the individuals and you know, and how we approach dealing with those issues.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks to the panelists for your information and your response to that question. If I can come to you next, then Lela, to lead on this, but ask you a question: how do political and other events of public interest influence the traction of the far right? And the subsequent question linked to that is, how would the police be better equipped for this? I perhaps might leave that second part for our two police colleagues, panelists, sorry, but by all means, if you have a view on that, interested to hear that as well, Lela. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I'll definitely leave that for my esteemed colleagues, but we've sort of touched on this already. I think, like no other sort of ideology within this space, the far right really gained traction around particular trigger events, as I like to call them. You know, we've seen protest activity related to the far right in relation to things such as migration, the supposed influence of specific religious or ethnic minorities, child sexual exploitation, equalities agendas, persecutions of military personnel, removal of public symbols associated with Britain's colonial history, you know, support of homeless veterans, and in no other case as strongly as with COVID-19. And I think around those events is really easy to see how the far right are very, very clever and able to take control of a narrative around those particular trigger events or political situations. And that, I suppose, must make it really difficult for policing, because when those groups are always the first ones to have a voice in these arenas, then everybody always listens to that first. If we think of corruption around COVID-19 and this whole thing of the sort of anti-police agenda, that was a very difficult thing to come back at, because we weren't there at the forefront to say, no, this isn't what's happening. So I think for me, in relation to the far right, that's what's most difficult, is that you never know how and in what way the far right are going to use particular events as a way to attract new followers and new recruits. And like what Jess said, we see lots of people that will campaign around these ideologies who would never have associated themselves with far right ideologies before, because of a specific issue. During COVID-19, for example, there was this massive, all of a sudden, influx of people associated with alternative therapies and certain types of exercise that suddenly became involved in far right organizations. And I think that is a really, really difficult thing to police. So I'd be interested to hear what John and Phil think about the challenges there specifically.
Okay, thanks very much. If I come to our two policing panelists then for your views, please.
Do you want to kick off with this?
I'll kick off. Yeah, as has been said, it's very difficult when you don't know, you can't predict what the event is that the narratives are going to latch onto. It's very difficult to counter that. I suppose it's more under the government's contest strategy. There's obviously various strands of anti-terrorism activity that go on, and under the pursue strand, under the prevent strand, as well as the sort of individual tailored prevent disruptions to try and bring individuals away from being drawn to radicalization. That's also the umbrella under which the government conducts big messaging and tries to counter narratives in the online space. And I suppose the problem is that takes quite a bit of time for that messaging to build up, to layer up, to be able to disseminate to the relevant portals and the relevant places where people are going to gather information. So when you're dealing with kind of single issue events that are difficult to predict, then that messaging is going to hugely lag. It is not going to be quick to be tailored to counteract that. So I think it's a huge problem as to how we can be better equipped. So that's an extraordinarily large question.
Yeah, a very difficult one. As we saw during after London riots, put lots of police on the streets, very little crime happens. It's not rocket science. So it invariably is a matter of resources. But obviously, with the type of work that we're doing to battle the far right and look at what's happening and what events they're targeting, we're working very heavily in the digital space, and that sort of side of our business is growing exponentially all the time, and I feel sometimes we need to look at how we exploit that better and make it more effective going forward.
Okay, thank you. Jess, anything to add from your side at all?
Just to pick up on what you've been saying, all of you, about I think there is an element of the far right are very good at manipulating events too. So something might happen that might be totally unrelated to extremism in any way, an attack, mugging, something that triggers. But while there might be a perfectly, acceptable, public, peaceful response to that event, the far right are very good at picking that up and then amplifying it and calling in their hordes of people that follow them in the online space to turn it into something that it was not originally, or like Layla was saying, to draw in people that you would never have thought would have been gotten involved before, draw them into something that they perhaps themselves don't even quite understand the extreme nature of what they're being drawn into, because the far right is so good at manipulating the narrative and about masking the narrative. Really, they're very good at making something seem benign that is actually going to lead somebody down a pathway to something that can become very extreme very quickly. And I think that is an element that's difficult to grapple with, it probably goes back to intelligence services and how the intelligence services within policing are looking at the online space, how they track these networks, how to follow that type of clever manipulation of current events.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Next question, if I come to John and Phil, first of all, perhaps you can sort of highlight to us some of the current trends that you're seeing in your current policing work, and then I'll open that out to the rest of the panelists in terms of the trends that you might see from your respective roles in your institutes and universities.
Yeah, sure. Basically, the growth in demand. We're currently, sort of year on year going into record numbers. We've got around 800 active investigations at the moment. Approximately 600 of those are working jointly with our partners, and then the last few hundred, police-led. And they range from fundraising, radicalization, online radicalization, and preparing, the direct acts of terrorism. Just to give you some scope on that. So in the last 12 months, finishing December 22, there were 166 CT-related arrests. 31% of those were linked to the extreme right. And of the 166, 33 were those with children under the age of 18. And of that 33 children, 12 were extreme right wing and 17 were Islamist extremism. Currently, doesn't feel, and we were discussing this earlier, it doesn't feel like that. I would expect to see some parity or maybe even a flip in those numbers this year. Certainly, that's the way of feeling, and the people involved are getting younger, and we'll cover that at some point later, I'm sure. So yeah, the primary sort of manifestation of right wing currently is self-initiated, self-radicalized individuals in the online space. This was escalated, after, during and after the pandemic, and yeah, so that seems to be, and we're particularly concerned at the moment, and with the lack of legislative framework we have in how we deal and sort of prevent young people getting involved in the extreme right wing. And I suppose the next point I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, the next point is the mixed and unclear ideology. We've already touched upon, so I won't dwell on it, but that is certainly something we're seeing increasingly. There are recurrent strains of extreme right wing that we do see. Accelerationism, siege culture continues to be quite common in our casework. We're also seeing quite a lot of sort of esoteric neo-Nazism emerging. But as well as all of that, all of these frequently are cases, as well as the problems of the age and the vulnerabilities they present, is this element of unclear ideology as well. And we see people managing to seemingly in their own minds kind of sometimes successfully knit together almost Islamist extremism and extreme right-wing terrorism. This can be quite problematic because, as I come back to, for us to use the terrorism powers and to treat the matter as terrorism, we need to be able to present a coherent ideology that can ultimately explain to a jury what the ideology is. And then if that person isn't speaking to us in a police interview or hasn't made disclosures to their friends, family, education providers, whoever it is, and sort of made some effort to explain what is going on in their heads, how they've managed to link all these pieces together, then police are generally left kind of trying to construct our own understanding of their ideology through looking at their digital devices, looking at their downloads, kind of looking at internet search histories, what they've been researching, what they've been reading. And sometimes we can't make it make sense. It makes sense to them, but that's because it's a unique perspective, and then that can present real challenges. Then taking that case forward, both to the Crown Prosecution Service to seek charges, and ultimately to explain to a jury why the acts that we say they're conducting were being done for a terrorist purpose.
And I suppose the last point quickly, Keith, sorry, is going back to the age of these offenders now, getting younger and younger. We're dealing, quite often with 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and that's not a comfortable space for us to be in equally. These are children who are vulnerable through mental health issues, neurodiversity, and and it's again a double-edged sword in that it's difficult for us to assess the risk to make sure that we are keeping the larger public safe. But equally, when it comes to some sort of intervention having to take place, it's difficult, as mentioned by Phil, for us to explain sufficiently and coherently to the CPS or other support organisations to help that young person, young adult, child, most of the time now, get the right support at the right time.
Thanks very much. Thank you both. The rest of our panelists, any additional comments at all or not? Perhaps not. Okay, let's take a question then from our audience. So Gareth Harris, thank you very much for your question. It says that there's been several recent cases. He cites James Allchurch and Black Wolf Radio, where people have been convicted of disseminating views on radio stations and podcasts being characterized as right-wing extremists. And it asks the question on what criteria is used to judge this. Does this not necessarily imply an implicit definition? Where is the threshold? Anyone particularly like to respond to that one?
I can start. I would think probably John and Phil have something to say about this too. But I think this goes back to something that we were talking about at the beginning of the hour about how do you categorize these things? What we've just been talking about. How do you take something that somebody has mixed together, has put together themselves and make a case about how it is ideologically driven? Or I think this even goes back to the challenge of where something that is hateful and perhaps would be addressed under hate crime legislation meets what is extreme and what would be addressed under counterterrorism legislation. And I think that's a difficult line that a lot of countries are grappling with, how to walk that line right now. What is covered under free speech? What is hateful? What is harmful? What is then extreme where it meets the threshold of inciting violence or the counterterrorism threshold? And I think there's a larger conversation that needs to happen about how you define these things. If there is a way to clearly define them, which perhaps it's subjective to each case. I don't know. I'm sure John and Phil can comment on that. But this of where the hate crime legislation meets counterterrorism legislation, and we know with the far right that a lot of the young people, a lot of the people that are being driven into the far right are starting out with everyday racism or everyday sexism, and it's amplifying, it's moving them towards what becomes white supremacist or becomes violent misogynist or whatever it might turn into. So how can we think about those two elements? One, the types of everyday hate that are very prevalent in society, and how that we can lead some people down the road, mixed with their grievances, mixed with their challenges, to a violent extremist point of view, and how we need to think about the law and where the law stands, and where it should meet, where it needs to meet, where it shouldn't meet between hate crime legislation and counterterrorism legislation, and how difficult it is to define around hate speech versus free speech versus, incitement of violence.
Okay, thank you very much, Jess. John.
I suppose first example, first thing I say is that we are in very early discussions and conversations with CTT, Counterterrorism Division of the CPS. It is a partnership. We're not 9 times out of 10. We're not going to them with a finished case. We're going for advice as we're going through, as we're sort of gathering evidence to try and understand. Is this going to reach the threshold at all? This is something that is an ongoing conversation, and at the end of the day, the test is the law. Is this person breaching tact? And if they are, there will be, action will be taken, and they will be charged, and they'll go to court. As we know with Black Wolf Radio, Patton, Walsh, and Gibbons, they were found guilty this week of all 8 counts for each of them, and so there is a lot of very close work with the lawyers going on to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. And as far as definitions and things like that, I struggled to, those conversations are for the lawyer to sort of compare to the tact, and then give us the authority to charge if we reach that threshold.
You're muted, Keith.
I had to do it once, didn't I? I do apologise. Lelo, was there anything you'd like to add to that or not? Shall we move on to another question?
We can move on.
Okay. Some of the limitations and opportunities for policing of the far right, particularly within online spaces such as online games, what are they? And I suppose really, what are the police therefore missing? What do they need in order to help them respond perhaps better, or to be able to feel more comfortable in tackling that particular aspect of extremism?
I'm happy to start again, but I'm sure other people have things to say about this as well. I think one of the things that I've heard from police colleagues that I've been speaking with about the challenges of the online space is that some police departments are very well equipped to engage in the online space. Some are less well equipped, but there's always challenges around the legal and ethical restrictions of how do you investigate in this space? What are the parameters for how you track children, how you deal with people who are underage, how you can investigate, your own citizens, how you observe their freedoms while ensuring that you are protecting public safety when you're conducting these investigations. So I think I've heard that there are a lot of challenges around defining those legal and ethical parameters in the online space, which is challenging as more and more of the far right, I think, engagement is in the online space. I know something that we've been. Have I just been talking all that time and it's been muted?
Well, it was like a second.
Okay. Thanks. Something that we've been looking at specifically in the online space with the Extremism in Gaming Research Network that we do is about the online gaming space, because I think this is something that we're realizing the far right has quite a big impact. There's a lot of concern around the impact of the far right extremism, in the Western European, North American context. Far right extremism is the most prevalent sort of extremism in the online gaming space, but there are 3 billion gamers in the world. There's a lot of people that play online games. It's a way that you interact in the online space that's more community building than just social media engagement. So people find communities in the online gaming space, which in that community, you can either, enter into a positive community that can build your resilience, build positive relationships, or you can enter into a community that can ultimately reduce your resilience to violent extremist ideology or hate that might lead you into violent extremist ideology. So there are definitely challenges to think about with the online gaming space. There are elements of identity formation that are happening in these gaming spaces for young people, but also for adults. That they find friends that the people that they meet, is it open transnational space? So people that they meet, that they form a friendship with around the gameplay, but they don't actually know these people, and they don't know sort of where this peer group dynamic in the online gaming space can become problematic, because if you trust these people, you play their games with them, then you might be more open to what they might tell you, and it might be hateful. It might be something that would lead you down a pathway toward violent extremism. So there are a lot of concerns around the online gaming space that we're looking at, and we're working with policing colleagues. But one thing just to add real quick before we get everybody else's opinion is that there are also positive elements of the online space, right? There are positive ways that the online space can be used. There's in the North Yorkshire Police Department in the UK, they have a program called Cops versus Kids, and they use esports, British Esports Association, in partnership with them for the police department, developed an esports team, and they played with kids in the local community that they historically had a difficult relationship with. There was a challenge about trusting the police with that local community. So they used that program of playing sports with them in a space which they, participated in, and they wanted to participate in to build that bond of trust that then ultimately improves the relationship with police. So it can be a positive tool. It can also be a challenge when we're thinking about, I think, policing of the far right.
Thank you very much, Jess. Perhaps, Lele, you might like to talk a little bit, picking up on that sort of working with communities a little bit, and tell us a bit more about your sort of hate visuals work that you've been doing with the two projects, Street Snap and Flip the Streets.
Yeah, sure. And just to pick up on something that Jess just said first, I think the online gaming space and the use of it by the far right kind of highlights one of the biggest problems we've got in the online space in terms of how the far right are able to manipulate. So, they've been able really to take charge of the space in a way that very easily is not picked up by, moderation sort of activities across social media platforms and that kind of thing. You have your bespoke games, which are very obviously have a far right intent. But then, when you start to think about the othering that happens within these sort of chat spaces and that kind of thing, it can be very easily missed. And that's a very difficult thing, I think, to police. Not even thinking about geographical restrictions and all of that kind of stuff. But in regards to hateful visuals, that's something that we see the far right taking advantage of a lot in the online space. The use of memes, the use of images, the use of symbols to further disseminate what it is they're doing. And one of the key strategies that's been going on for a very long time now is the use of stickering. So the use of stickers for far right organizations to gain a presence, I suppose, and within their local communities. So on Telegram channels and things like that, they will provide sticker kits and ways to sort of print and download stickers, and they will call to action really people that follow them to say, sticker these out in your local community. And these stickers have two purposes normally. One is in grouping, so to try and show the presence of that particular group around a local area, and perhaps sometimes make it look like there's more people involved in this than there are, but also the othering as well. So it could be, about the enemy as such. So I've been working with counter-terrorism police in Wales and a number of different local councils to try and understand better and monitor hateful visuals on the streets. So look at, what's going on, and are there trends that we can see, and are they in particular areas? So we're in the process of developing an app because at the moment there's no official way to record and monitor these kind of things. There's a mandate, of course, to take down hateful graffiti and stickers and what have you, and normally that's within 48 hours, and that's great, but we're losing all of that intelligence. So we're building an app right now called Street Snap to try and mitigate that, and so that it can also be used for intervention purposes. So if you can see around a particular area, or county, that there seems to be a lot of, far right extremist material, for example, you can focus in on those interventions. And I think lots of people probably think that is just about the offline space, but it really does link to the online space when we think about how this stuff is being disseminated. And it's really amazing, actually, how preventative policing is working in this area, and the sort of steps they're taking to try and work in this space is really inspiring, actually.
Okay, thanks very much. John and Phil, sort of limitations and opportunities of policing this online space then from your perspective?
I mean, the two perennial issues with policing the online space, anonymity and encryption. We sort of come back to, obviously, it's most communication platforms online, it's a high degree of anonymity, it's varying levels, but you can present your own username. So effectively, if the police or intelligence services become aware that there's someone out there potentially committing a criminal act, then we're effectively as police in a space where we have to go to the third party, go to the communication service provider to help us try and resolve that anonymous handle into a suspect in the real world. And the response we get from that can vary hugely. Some tech companies, to their credit, behave, we would say, very responsibly, and as long as it's a sort of well formatted, sort of appropriate and proportionate request from law enforcement, will happily kind of come back and engage with us and help us work to identify that person. Others will fall back on a position of saying, we will only do what is required, what we're required to do in law. And then the issue for that policing, within the UK, we are but one jurisdiction. The kind of servers, the companies, the tech companies that host this stuff could be across the world. And if they're saying you need to get the equivalent of a court order, a production order, a subpoena, whatever it's called in that jurisdiction, then that builds in a huge delay where we're going to have to either engage with international partners or potentially effectively just write a letter to the local authorities there to ask them to do this. I'm not exaggerating when I say this can build in years of delays to an investigation. And I think it's fair to say some tech companies will deliberately position themselves within the jurisdiction where they know that we don't have strong relationships in this area to enable us to frustrate this. So that is an issue with the anonymity. In terms of encryption, there's obviously a very public debate going on at the moment about online encryption, and so I won't try to address that here. Ultimately, it comes down to the choice that we all have to make as the public around should we accept the freedom of an ability to communicate in the knowledge that the state can never access that remotely, can never view that, and is that freedom worth the knowledge that certainly the far right, but beyond that, all forms of terrorism, people traffickers, child smugglers, sexual abusers will no doubt congregate to that area in order to conduct their communications, do their business. And how you feel about that it's a matter for us all individuals to express through our elected representatives and for the public to reach consensus on it. So I won't say it's a huge challenge in the online space.
And in furtherance of Lela's point about stickering and things like that, certainly our experience, we found that flip from online to real world, that tends to be a very first part and is almost like a test of fidelity to the cause. And if you want to join, prove to us that you've been stickering or postering in your local area. Now, obviously, yes, that can be potentially captured online, but equally, we've got some real world opportunities. Everybody's got CCTV. Everybody's got a Ring doorbell or like device in the area. So again, if we can identify these people early doors, and if they are children, use that information to put the correct level of intervention in. Again, we're not in the business of criminalizing children. We know TACT, terrorism. The Terrorism Act can be a sledgehammer to crack a nut sometimes. So it's not lost on us that if we are dealing with children, we should be dealing with them appropriately and making sure the interventions into them are at the right level.
Thank you all very much. Let's take another question from our invited audience. So Brendan Smith, picking up on what you were saying about teenagers in particular and younger people, John. So how much of an impact do you think that the COVID-19 lockdowns had on the rates of radicalization of young teenagers and young adults on the internet, specifically on the deep web and the dark net? And do you think that with the lockdown allowed individuals to become a captive virtual audience and to become self-radicalized to a greater extent? Perhaps come straight to you, John and Phil, if I may, please.
Yeah, yes. It was certainly an accelerator, where the state was forcing young impressionable minds to be locked indoors and entertain themselves, and increasingly going down deeper, darker rabbit holes. Those conversations were happening online, and it's certainly, and I think we're getting the back end of it now, and one would hope that at some point we will reach the hump and come over the other side, but we're not there yet. Obviously, some of the difficulties that we have is that a lot of the legislation predates this kind of the technology and the difference to the way that the groups are not meeting. There's not these real world meeting of groups we're finding as much. This is very much an online anonymous conversation. Simple little things like the offences of wearing a uniform or arranging a meeting to further activities of a prescribed organisation, things like that. Not really applicable anymore. But again, as always, the framework of the laws that we're working with a reactive beast to what we're facing at the time, and it will take time. We need to do better with young people. That's no doubt. We're trying to do what we can within the framework we have, but I think it could be a considerable better box of tools for us available to us, and certainly something that will help radicalization of young people going forward.
Thank you very much. The rest of the panelists, Jess, would you like to say something?
I was just going to add to that. I think it's easy to talk about young people, and I know that that's the largest percentage of sort of cases that you're seeing, like you were saying, John and Phil, but I think it's important to remember that people of all ages, I think, were really quite caught up in the sort of anti-lockdown, anti-COVID, anti-vax sort of, and if people that you wouldn't normally expect to, I mean, you wouldn't think of these people as extremists, mothers and people that were just Googling how to keep their children safe, and their sort of, algorithmic amplification of some of these ideas take them down these rabbit holes of different types of conspiracy and different types of extremism. So I think that it's just an important thing to add, that it is people of all ages, and that it's quite easy to go from something like anti-vax, where you might have a very specific reason that you feel anti-vax, to then being drugged into anti-government because now you're anti-lockdown, to then being drugged into these other elements of where that might then meet white supremacist groups, so it's quite a winding path, but they're very well connected to each other. And I think it's something to just note that there are a lot of people that started somewhere that didn't mean to end up where they ended up, but that radicalization pathway is quite easy to slip down once you start down that way.
Indeed.
No, just add to that, Keith, is that okay? It's really interesting what you mentioned there about, it's all diverse types of people that are sort of going down this rabbit hole. And COVID-19 in that sense was nothing new for the far right. They were doing this already. We had some of the more traditional far right groups in Britain that used to use Facebook and that kind of thing. They would use things like sharing a picture of a puppy and say, like and share if you're against animal cruelty. So you'd have someone sort of harmlessly involving themselves and thinking, oh yes, I'm against animal cruelty, and then looking on their page and then maybe seeing something else. The difference with COVID-19 is it was just the catalyst, the perfect opportunity, the perfect storm for the far right to really take advantage of attracting people that they never have before. And I just wanted to go back a little bit on a previous point, which is the importance of thinking about the effect of deplatforming as well. So we've seen a lot of groups being taken off the mainstream sites, and this is kind of linked to the issue around end-to-end encryption. And when they've moved to those more fringe alternative sites, the narratives have become more extreme. And yes, you've got less people watching and less people involved. And I do think that from a personal perspective, deplatforming is a good idea, but there is this question of what happens when they go more and more underground, and that's something that we're going to have to think about even more when it comes to end-to-end encryption. Are we going to see these groups become more extreme in what they're saying because there's less controls on that, and so I think that's something that policing will have to really consider, and I'm not sure what the answers are, sorry John and Phil, but something really important there.
Excellent, thanks very much. We'll take another question from our audience. Jordan Stevens, and you gave a sort of indication of this a bit earlier, John, with some figures, but I'd sort of blend his question in with another question I have, really, which is how extreme right-wing terrorism compare with other forms of terrorism, but also about what are the subtle nuances of dealing with the sort of far-right extremism versus other forms of extremism as well. And how that plays out in terms of the caseload and number of investigations and particular nuances of that, please.
That's a wide-ranging question. As far as differences, realistically, very little. Collecting evidence is collecting evidence. Yes, we will have to go to different places to collect that evidence, but that's our job. We need to collect the evidence available to us, and and present the best case we can. As far as, yeah, I don't think there's much nuance in the investigation.
I think with a far right investigation, for all the reasons that we've talked about, police find ourselves trying to piece together and understand the ideology a lot more. Obviously, with an Islamist style investigation, the kind of identifiers are very clear, and indeed, convictions have been made on very, almost some very brief code words kind of being found that are well understood, because they unlock a whole body of belief and understanding that is pretty well kind of known, and the world is now sadly very well versed in some of the kind of signs and identifiers of Islamist extremism. When we're dealing with the far right, we do, my investigations, definitely, you spend a lot more time in almost academic circles trying to sort of understand what we mean, what they mean, what these symbols mean. Signs, symbology is very important to the far right, obsessively so at times. When you look at some of the belief systems are incredibly Byzantinely complex, the way that they sort of have to jump from different bits of authority and go and find an answer here to sort of find an answer there. And so we find ourselves exploring the mental space, the mental side, I would say, of the suspects significantly more than we do with other forms of extremism and terrorism that part's kind of done for us quite quickly.
Yeah, no, the watchword is mindset. We have the act, which is commits the offence, but why, and it's the mindset which is the difficult bit to assist us present that case, make it understandable for those 12 people in court.
Thank you both. Any additional comments from the rest of our panel, or shall I move on to another question from our audience?
Can I just add something,
Yes.
Keith, real quick? So we've been doing this. We just finished this project looking at comparing the far right context in the UK and in Australia, and we've sort of done that alongside looking at some different geographical locations and the far right. And I think it's interesting that there's usually, or always, perhaps I can say, a very specific local context, right? In the UK, there's a very specific local context to the grievances that the far right utilizes to run their narratives. And it might even be specific to different parts of the UK, to different parts of the country. But in that local specific grievance, there is also always this connection to the wider world of far-right extremisms. I mean, the US exports its brand of far-right extremism to the rest of the world. It imports stuff from Western Balkans that came originally from the conversations in Serbia. So there's narratives being moved around, then being applied to the local context, being mutated and applied to the local context. But something that we found that I think is interesting and perhaps useful in policing is that there are connectors. So there are narratives, there are part of that narratives that run across all the different local contexts. And one of them that we specifically looked at, I do a lot on gender, was misogyny, and sort of the presence of that violent misogynist elements is something that appeared in every local context. And the anti-LGBTQ+, anti-minority, anti-immigrant, I mean, these are elements that appear in the narrative, and it connects, and it allows people who are far-right extremists in the UK to talk to people who are far-right extremists in Australia. And while they might have different local grievances, they connect to each other, and they find a common, a commonality, a common language in misogyny, because that's part of both of their grievance narratives, part of both of their ideological perspectives. So I think that's something that is to think about as we go forward with how do we, grapple with the online nature of this, how do we grapple with the transnational nature of this, is to find those linking elements where different groups across different spaces are having a commonality, and where that allows them to share ideas across their spaces.
Thank you very much, Jess. Leila, anything additional from yourself? No. Okay, thank you. Taking another question then, a very topical one from Graham Davies. He has asked about the effect that the war in Ukraine has had on the far right. He does mention that in his view, far right activists fighting on both sides of the conflict. and that's divided the far right across Europe and to some extent in the US as well. But Lela, perhaps I could come to you first of all in relation to that question, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one, a really important question. I mean, I think it's had a lot of effect in terms of, both within the war itself and the military there, but also in terms of, how the public have sort of reacted to it as well. So I would see it in a very similar way to some of the other sort of trigger political events that we've seen, and in terms of the fact that it's another thing for them to very quickly latch onto and provide answers to in a way that serves their own agendas. Yeah, I'll probably leave it there to other colleagues to elaborate.
Okay, thanks very much. Jess?
Yeah, I mean, I think just quickly, we definitely seen, like Will was saying, that it's wielded when it's useful as a tool, right? It's not when it's not, because it is a divisive element between different far right groups. I think some found that it actually was harmful to their networks more than it was helpful, so they stopped using it as part of their grievance pattern. But some of them, of course, did find it useful, and I think it's one of those elements, the way that Putin obviously framed the original invasion narrative around, rooting out the Nazis in Ukraine, which of course there are a huge amount of far right influences in Russia as well. So there was an element, I think, of the way it was used in the geopolitical conversation around the conflict, to where it allowed it into a wider mainstream narrative. And I think that is sort of dangerous. And I think that was also something that happened with COVID-19, right? Where it's become mainstream now to talk about extreme topics and extreme ideas. And that sort of mainstreaming of the extremism is dangerous, because people talk about it without understanding what it means. Then they start Googling it, then you go down these rabbit holes. And I think it's more than anything, I think the Ukraine conflict has highlighted in some ways where this mainstreaming of the extreme conversation has brought challenges to the geopolitical conversation. But I think the far right has been perhaps shied away from it in a lot of ways, because it's divisive to them, as you say.
Thanks very much. I'm going to squeeze in, if I may, a quick question for John and Phil in particular. It comes from Richard Link, and we've only got a few minutes left, but so I'll ask you to be fairly brief. There's an interesting question, because it says, when you're dealing with an incident that perhaps has a racial element to it, how do you decide whether the investigation should be conducted under the Terrorism Act or perhaps under Public Order Act for inciting racial hatred? Because in one case, under the Terrorism Act, that carries the label of a terrorist, and obviously under the Public Order Act, that carries the label of a racist. How do you make that distinction?
I think it's a very difficult distinction to make, which you can see borne out by the fact that often whether an incident is ultimately a terrorism incident is decided by the senior national coordinator, and it can sometimes, as we sometimes see, there can be a delay of days at times after an incident's actually happened before enough information can be gathered to determine whether it is a terrorism incident. It comes back to an application of the test laid out in the Terrorism Act 2000, using the best information available at the time. I think increasingly, though, we are seeing kind of instances where, and you'll see it quite a lot in the news, where there'll be an incident, perhaps the ideology underpinning it is unclear, so there'll be a sort of parallel stance taken where it is investigated by local police under sort of, under traditional policing powers, so looking at it as a conventional crime or as a hate crime, but with a sort of terrorism assessment being done in the background by counterterrorism policing, where perhaps some support is being offered around sort of digital analytics and some of the more advanced kind of services like that, to try and inform that holistic assessment once all the evidence is available. But it can be a very fine line, and I don't pretend it's an easy one.
No, yeah, it's a perennial problem. Where is that threshold? We hope it's a bit of common sense applied, but sometimes it's quite straightforward, strict. Has it reached the threshold? It's not to say equally, if it's an ongoing terrorist investigation, that we would use sort of public order or traditional policing methods as an intervention option, just to sort of cut things down really quickly and slow things down and bring them into our control rather than let things run. So it's not an easy one, but it's one that we do sort of constantly assess.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Unfortunately, time's got the better of us, so I do apologise if you raised a question and didn't have the opportunity to have it answered. But by all means, please understand that all questions were read, and some of them were answered in the round, I think, in terms of some responses to other questions as well. It remains for me to give a heartfelt thank you to our panelists. That's Dr. Leila Nouri, to John Hughes, and to Phil Pike, and to my colleague Jess White as well. But to you, the audience, as well, thank you very much for listening in and for participating and for your questions. And I hope you found the event extremely useful. Do stay tuned for further events in this series. If you want to look back and rewatch this event, it'll be available on our website shortly after today's closure. But there's previous events in the series on countering far-right financing, radical right in Latin America, the importance of preventing and countering far-right extremism within security services are all part of this series, and we look forward to continuing our work in this space and to welcoming many of you back to future webinar events and research opportunities as well. So thank you once again. I wish you all a good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on wherever you are.